They warned me about her, the rebel who refused to follow the rules. I didn't listen, and it changed my life forever. I've always been the kind of person who followed the rules. It wasn't something I had to think about. I just did. The rules were there for a reason, my parents always said. Follow them and life would reward you. And for the most part, it worked. My life was predictable. Wake up at 7 a.m., dress in neatly pressed clothes, work hard in school, say the right things, make the right choices, and avoid anything that might veer off the carefully laid out path. I was the golden child, the one who didn't question expectations. I went to bed each night knowing I was doing exactly what everyone wanted me to do. But there was something missing. It wasn't something I could name, just a quiet, persistent ache. A feeling that there was more to life than the steady routine, the polite conversations, the endless cycle of safe, predictable decisions. I told myself I was fine. People like me didn't need excitement or chaos. But deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that I was trapped, even if the walls were invisible. And then she came into my life. Her name was Lily. She wasn't the kind of girl you introduced to your parents or brought home to a polite family dinner. She didn't fit neatly into any category or box. Lily was a storm, wild and untamed, with a laugh that echoed like a dare, and eyes that seemed to burn through every pretense. I met her at a pop-up art show that I wasn't even supposed to be at. A friend had dragged me there, promising it would be fun, in a way I didn't understand. It was loud and chaotic, with music blaring and people talking over one another in excited bursts. I felt out of place, uncomfortable in my neatly ironed shirt, wondering how soon I could leave without seeming rude. That's when I saw her. She stood in the corner painting on a giant canvas as if the crowd didn't exist. Her hands were smeared with colors, and her hair was tied up in a loose knot, strands falling over her face. She wasn't trying to be perfect or polished. She was alive in a way I didn't know people could be. When she noticed me staring, she didn't look away. Instead, she smirked, cocking her head to the side like she was sizing me up. "You look like you don't belong here," she said, her voice teasing but not unkind. "I don't," I admitted, feeling my face heat up. "Good," she said, stepping closer. "You should stick around anyway. You might surprise yourself." And just like that, my world shifted. Lily wasn't just different. She was everything I didn't know I needed. Bold, fearless, and utterly unapologetic. She wasn't afraid to question the rules I'd spent my whole life following. In that moment, I knew one thing for sure. Nothing about my life would ever be predictable again. The pop-up art show was everything I avoided. Loud, chaotic, and bursting with the kind of raw energy I'd always found overwhelming. My friend Noah had dragged me along, insisting I needed to live a little. I stood near the edge of the room, awkward and out of place in my neatly pressed shirt, watching people float between splashes of paint, experimental music, and spontaneous bursts of laughter. That's when I saw her. She stood in the middle of the chaos, but somehow it felt like the chaos revolved around her. A streak of red paint ran across her cheek like war paint, and her hands were smeared with colors from the canvas she was working on. Her hair was wild, barely contained by the loose braid hanging over her shoulder. She looked untamed, free, and completely comfortable in the mayhem around her. I tried not to stare, but my eyes kept finding her. It wasn't just how she looked, it was how she moved, with an effortless confidence that felt magnetic. She was pouring her soul onto the canvas in front of her, and the crowd around her buzzed with excitement, whispering as though witnessing something extraordinary. Noah nudged me, catching me in the act. "She's something, huh? Who is she?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "That's Lily," he said, grinning. "She's kind of a big deal in these circles. Wild, isn't she?" Wild didn't begin to cover it. As if sensing my gaze, she looked up. Our eyes met, and I felt something shift, like a rope tightening, pulling me closer to her without my consent. She didn't look away. Instead, a smirk tugged at her lips as if she'd caught me in some unspoken challenge. "Enjoying the show?" she called out, loud enough to rise above the music. Caught off guard, I stammered. Yeah, it's interesting." She tilted her head, her smirk widening. "Interesting? That's one way to describe it. What's the other way?" "I don't know," I admitted, embarrassed by how awkward I sounded. She laughed, a bright, carefree sound that somehow made me feel lighter. Without missing a beat, she walked over, wiping her hands on a paint-streaked rag before extending one to me. "I'm Lily." "James," I said, shaking her hand before realizing too late that her palm was still covered in paint. Her grin widened. Now you're part of the art. I looked down to see streaks of blue and green smudged on my hand. Normally I'd have been annoyed, but instead I found myself laughing. That was Lily. In a single moment, she'd turned my world upside down. She didn't care about rules or order. She didn't fit into the perfect little boxes I'd spent my life living in, and I couldn't look away. Lily had a way of pulling me into her world without trying. It wasn't just her wild energy or the way she lived so unapologetically. It was the way she made life feel alive. With her, even the simplest moments felt electric, charged with possibilities I'd never allowed myself to consider before. It started small. A late-night text. Come outside. When I stepped into the cool night air, she was waiting on her old bike, grinning like she already knew I'd say yes. Where are we going? I asked. You'll see, she said, tossing me a helmet. But I'll warn you, it's not boring. She wasn't kidding. That night, I found myself perched on a rooftop overlooking the city, Lily sitting beside me, legs dangling off the edge as if gravity didn't apply to her. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. She pointed out constellations and told me stories about them, half real, half made up. I didn't care which was which, I just liked hearing her voice. But it wasn't just grand adventures that drew me closer. It was the little things, like the way she hummed off-key when she thought no one was listening, or how her laughter felt like a spark in the dark, impossible to ignore. One afternoon, I found her sitting on the floor of her tiny apartment, surrounded by scraps of paper, paintbrushes, and cans of spray paint. What are you doing? I asked, stepping over the chaos. Creating, she said simply. Want to help? I hesitated. I'm not exactly the creative type. Good, she said, shoving a brush into my hand. That means you won't overthink it. An hour later, we were both covered in paint, laughing so hard we could barely breathe. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so free, so untethered from the expectations that had always weighed me down. But as close as we became, our differences were impossible to ignore. I liked plans. She thrived on spontaneity. I found comfort in structure. She hated anything that even smelled like rules. Sometimes, her unpredictability felt like a breath of fresh air. Other times, it left me scrambling, unsure if I could keep up. One evening, we were walking through a crowded street festival when she stopped abruptly, pulling me toward a small, dimly lit alley where a group of street performers were setting up. Let's stay, she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. I don't know, I said, glancing at my watch. It's getting late. Her smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by a flicker of frustration. You're always watching the clock, she said softly. Why can't you just let go for once? Her words stung because she wasn't wrong. I wanted to let go, to embrace her world completely, but some part of me still clung to the safety of order. That night I realized loving Lily wasn't just about stepping into her chaos. It was about finding a way to make our two worlds fit together. Loving Lily was never supposed to be easy. I'd known that from the start, but knowing didn't make it any less painful when our worlds began to clash. It started with little things, her habit of showing up late to plans without a second thought, or how she'd disappear for hours, chasing her next big idea while I sat waiting, worried and frustrated. I thrived on stability, on knowing what came next, but with Lily, there was no map. Her life was a whirlwind, and I was struggling to keep up. You don't get it, do you? She said one night after I confronted her for missing a dinner with my parents. I can't live by your schedule, James. That's not who I am. Is it so wrong to want some consistency? I shot back, the tension boiling over. Do you even care how this looks? My parents were watching every move and you didn't even bother to show up. She threw her hands in the air. Why should I care about impressing people who've already decided I'm not good enough? Her words cut deeper than I wanted to admit because they were true. My parents didn't understand Lily. They saw her as a distraction, a reckless force threatening to pull me off the safe path they'd worked so hard to build for me. She's fun, sure, my mother said after meeting her. But people like her don't stay. They don't build lives. They burn through them. Even my friends started to chime in. She's cool, but don't you think she's a little intense? Noah asked cautiously. You're the guy who likes structure. She's the girl who doesn't follow any rules. I wanted to ignore them, to believe that love could overcome the gap between us. But doubt crept in, whispering questions I didn't want to answer. Could Lily ever fit into my life? Could I fit into hers? The breaking point came during one of her pop-up art events. It was chaotic and loud, as always, but this time I felt completely out of place. While she painted under the glow of neon lights, I stood on the sidelines, watching as strangers cheered her on. I wanted to be part of her world, but I felt invisible, like a spectator in my own relationship. Afterward, I tried to talk to her about it. "You don't see me," I said, my voice trembling with frustration. "Not really. You're always chasing the next big thing. But where does that leave us?" She stared at me, her expression unreadable. "I see you, James," she said quietly. "I see you so clearly it scares me. But I'm not going to change who I am, just to make you comfortable." The fight left us both raw and uncertain. For the first time, I wondered if love was enough to bridge the gap between us, or if we were too different to make it work. After the fight, things between Lily and me were different. The energy that used to light up our relationship felt dimmer, weighed down by everything we hadn't said. We didn't break up, not officially, but it felt like we were walking a tightrope, waiting for the inevitable fall. For days, I wrestled with my feelings. Loving Lily was like standing in the middle of a storm, exhilarating and terrifying all at once. I wanted her, I wanted us, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe I wasn't enough for her world, or she wasn't right for mine. I threw myself into my routine, trying to convince myself that life made more sense without the chaos she brought. But no matter how many hours I spent at work, or how many perfectly planned days I had, it all felt hollow. My predictable life had been fine before I met her, but now it felt like I was only half alive. Then came the invitation, a handwritten note left on my doorstep, messy but unmistakably hers. "Meet me at the old train station tonight. No questions. Just come." When I arrived, the station was empty, the air thick with the smell of rust and rain. She was there, waiting on the platform with her arms wrapped around herself, her usual fire tempered by something softer. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said, her voice quieter than I'd ever heard it. "You didn't give me much choice," I replied, trying to sound lighthearted. But the tension between us was impossible to ignore. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her courage. "I know I've made things hard," she said, her eyes fixed on the tracks below. "I know I've hurt you." "Lily—" "No, let me finish," she interrupted, her voice firm. "I've spent my whole life fighting against everything. Rules, expectations, anyone who tried to put me in a box. But I never stopped to think about what that fight cost the people who cared about me." I didn't know what to say, so I stayed silent, letting her words fill the space between us. "I can't promise I'll ever be the kind of person who plans every detail or fits into your perfect world," she said. "But I don't want to lose you, James. So, if it means meeting you halfway, if it means trying, I'll do it." Her vulnerability hit me like a punch to the chest. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her armor, the fear behind her defiance, and suddenly the decision that had felt so impossible became clear. "I don't want you to change," I said, stepping closer. "I just want you to let me in. No walls, no running. Just you and me figuring it out together." Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in weeks she smiled, a real, unguarded smile. At that moment I realized I was done living in fear. I didn't know what the future held, but with Lily, I was ready to find out. Loving Lily wasn't about changing her. It was about learning to embrace the chaos she carried and discovering how it could fit into my life. But it wasn't just about her. It was about me too. In the weeks that followed our conversation at the train station, something shifted. We didn't try to force our worlds together. Instead, we found a way to meet in the space between them. Lily began opening up about her fears, her struggles, and why she'd always run from anything that felt like it could trap her. And I stopped clinging to the idea of perfection and let myself enjoy the spontaneity she brought into my life. We didn't lose who we were. We grew into something more. One afternoon, she dragged me to an art festival in a rundown warehouse on the edge of town. It was the kind of place I would have avoided before meeting her. Loud, messy, and completely out of my comfort zone. But this time, I didn't feel out of place. I felt alive. "See?" she said, nudging me as we stood in front of a massive mural painted directly onto the warehouse wall. "It's not so bad to let go, is it?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Not bad at all." But it wasn't just about her pulling me into her world. Lily started to show up for me in ways I never expected. She came to dinner with my parents, not as someone trying to prove herself, but simply as Lily. She was honest and unfiltered, and though my parents still didn't entirely understand her, they saw how much she meant to me. There were still challenges, of course. She'd roll her eyes when I'd suggest planning a weekend in advance, and I'd grown when she decided on a whim to rearrange all the furniture in our apartment. But we learned to laugh through it. Slowly, we built a life that was ours, a balance between her love for freedom and my need for stability. One night, as we sat on the rooftop of our apartment building, watching the city lights flicker like stars, I turned to her and asked, "Do you ever regret any of this?" She looked at me, her expression soft but steady. "No," she said, "because you're the first person who ever made me feel like I didn't have to fight alone." Her words stayed with me long after that night. Loving Lily had taught me that life didn't have to be lived by the rules I'd always followed. It could be unpredictable, messy, and beautiful all at once. She showed me how to take risks, to step outside the lines I'd drawn around myself, and to find joy in the unexpected. In the end, Lily didn't just teach me how to love her. She taught me how to love life, and for that, I would always be grateful. Could you fall for someone who challenges everything you've ever known? Would you risk the comfort of predictability for the thrill of the unknown? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. If this tale of love, growth, and finding balance moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more heartwarming and dramatic stories. Share this video with someone who believes love can bridge any gap. You might just inspire them today.